So Christopher Nolan's much anticipated adaptation of the Odyssey may have you wondering, why now? Well, the answer is that the Odyssey is really a universal story. It's about a soldier who's been away from home for a very long time, coming back to his family. And so it's at the same time a homecoming tale, but also a family drama, where we learn about how someone who's been away from his home, away from his family for 20 years, tries to figure out his place in society. Hi, I'm Jaclyn Neel. I'm a professor of Greek and Roman Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, and today I'm going to react to Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. We don't know very much about this Odyssey adaptation because it's still in production, but this is what I'd like to see from a director like Christopher Nolan. Based on what's been released, we are looking at a fairly close adaptation of the Odyssey. This takes place in Greece, people are in ancient costume, so we're not thinking about something totally way out there. Based on that, what I think really would be nice to focus on would be the more internal struggle that we see Odysseus go through as he goes from the war element of his world to the domestic element on the way home, and as he interacts with all of those monsters who force him to interact between war and peace, and how Odysseus learns from that and gets bigger. What we know from Christopher Nolan's previous work is that he likes to play with time, and actually Homer is the ideal classical author for playing with time because the poem tells us about a world that took place somewhere in the 12th century BCE, but this is an oral poem that was passed down orally, that is mouth by mouth, people not writing it down until fairly late in the composition process. So in Homer, we have things that go back to the 12th century, and we have things that date to around the 8th century when our first kind of Homer was writing, and sometimes even things that suggest the 7th century. So there's no real date that we can put easily on the Odyssey, and we see that in some of the pictures that we've gotten from behind the scenes. So for example, in this picture where we see the armor that the Greeks seem to be wearing, we have a helmet called the Corinthian helmet, which was really a product of the classical Greek period. So I've given you an example of that on the screen. It's green. This Corinthian helmet is something which you would see at the time of someone like Plato, but not really someone like Odysseus. So you can see that in some of our pictures, we have Odysseus fighting in 5th century gear, because this was a scene that 5th century people would have recognized on a 5th century pot. So it's a 12th century story being retold in 5th century dress for 5th century audiences. And I think, again, that element of time is really something that Nolan will enjoy playing with. At the same time, someone like Odysseus would be wearing a boar's tusk helmet, which is, as it suggests, a kind of ivory helmet, which is mentioned not in the Odyssey, but in the Iliad as a helmet that was given to Odysseus to wear in battle. We see boar's tooth helmets as real Mycenaean armor, so that would have been, again, at the time that the Trojan War took place on Mycenaean drinking vessels, as we see in this picture here, where Mycenaean warriors, who are dressed in something that certainly looks like a boar's tooth or other animal tooth helmets, are going off to war. This is called the warrior vase because it has scenes of warriors. So that's a super nice castle. It is not from ancient Greece. It's pretty clearly medieval. And when we look at some of the walls from Homeric Greece that do survive archaeologically, the one thing that we know about them is that they use giant, giant stones. This is called Cyclopean masonry, and it's named after the Cyclops, one of the monsters from Homer's Odyssey, who himself is a giant. So what we have here are the walls from on the left side of the screen Troy, the Troy 6, which we believe was the Troy of the Homeric tales, and then on the right side, the Lion Gate of Mycenae, which is where Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks, is supposed to have lived. Both of these date to the Homeric period, roughly the 12th century BCE, and as you can hopefully tell, they've got big stones that would have been extremely labor intensive to put up and was a sign of wealth for these incredibly rich kings. So those little tiny stones very much belong to a later period. So the most important question, is Matt Damon the right choice to play Odysseus? And I'm going to go out on a limb and say yes, for two main reasons. First, because Odysseus is an everyman. He is not the greatest warrior. He is not the richest guy. He is clever, but it's really his wits that make him stand out from all the other warriors at Troy. And other than that, he's kind of a simple guy. And Matt Damon has made a career out of playing an everyman. Odysseus is an everyman. The other thing that I think is really important is that Odysseus is coming home after 20 years of war. The Odyssey is only the last 6 weeks of Odysseus's time in combat. So he's fairly old. He's middle-aged by the time that the Odyssey takes place. And Matt Damon, not to say anything against him, is also middle-aged. So he's the right age and the right persona. Christopher Nolan's films are generally pretty dark, and I think that element of his work is a really good match for the Odyssey. The Odyssey is not a happy tale. It's a story of a man who loses basically everything in his attempt to get back home, and when he gets there, discovers that his wife, although she's been completely loyal to him, is threatened by a large group of men from the area surrounding her, and then he has to go to war essentially again, just to get his own wife back, which is the result that both of them want. Because of all the dark elements of this story, the Odyssey's been used for the past 20 years or so as a way of helping modern combat veterans deal with PTSD, because the Odyssey covers a lot of the same emotions that veterans may have upon returning home from combat and reintegrating into peaceful society. We know that one of the main struggles that veterans have is dealing with combat trauma. It's quite clear that Odysseus does have combat trauma. He retells all of that combat trauma in the major flashback that takes up the central books of the Odyssey. When Odysseus visits the underworld, he meets a lot of his old comrades from battle, including Achilles, the major warrior hero of the Iliad, who says that he's really sad that he's in the underworld and he wishes he were alive, and if he could do it again, would choose to live unremembered rather than give his life. When Odysseus leaves for war, which we hear in other Homeric poems was very unwillingly, he tried his best to get out of fighting at Troy, his son Telemachus is an infant. When he returns, Telemachus is in his 20s, so he's missed his entire childhood, and that too is one of the struggles that unfortunately modern veterans do have to deal with. Jonathan Shea spent a very long time working with Vietnam veterans who had PTSD or other post-combat trauma regain a better mental state through reading Homer. We do know that there are two major types of adaptation. The first type is the faithful adaptation, also known as a strict adaptation. This means that the director or the writer is trying to recreate Homer's Odyssey as closely as possible and to follow it in every way. But there are also looser adaptations that take on important themes or characters and then have those characters interact in a different world. Some examples of a loose adaptation of the Odyssey are O Brother, Where Art Thou by the Coen brothers, or even a book like Ulysses by James Joyce. So a very loose adaptation can still tell us a lot about how audiences interact with Homer's Odyssey. As Odysseus goes home from the Trojan War, he encounters a lot of monsters, and this is also what happens to Ulysses Everett McGill in O Brother, Where Art Thou?
I figured as much back at the restaurant. That's why I invited y'all out here for this advanced tutorial.
What's going on, Big Dan?
It's all about the money, boys! That's it!
So in the Cyclops episode in Homer's Odyssey, the Cyclops eats Odysseus's men because he's not a human. So as we saw here, Pete, the character played by Tim Blake Nelson, actually fights back against this monster, while Ulysses, played by George Clooney, just kind of sits there and watches and kind of thinks in his brain. And that's the main characteristic of Odysseus that we see in the Odyssey. Although we hear from elsewhere in the Homeric poems that Odysseus is a good warrior, and in fact he'll show in the Odyssey that he is fully capable of fighting when he needs to, the main thing that distinguishes Odysseus from other Homeric characters is his brain, and how he's able to use his wits to get himself out of sticky situations.
How to do, ladies? Name of Pete.
Go to sleep, you little baby.
One thing I should say about the sirens is that in Homer's Odyssey, our sirens are only attractive because of their voice. We don't really see them as characters. And when we do, the little bits that we get suggest that they are monstrous, not like the women here who are not only singing beautifully, but also physically seductive. One of the fun things about the sirens in the movie versus the sirens in the Odyssey is that Odysseus actually tells his men to stuff wax in their ears and ties himself to his ship so that he's not able to go after the sirens. But as we see here, the Ulysses in this, or Odysseus in this version, is maybe a little bit less wise. Even though Odysseus is trying to get home to his wife Penelope, who it is stressed throughout the Odyssey is completely faithful to him for 2 decades, Odysseus himself not so much. So Odysseus has affairs with a number of divine, semi-divine women as he goes home. And this would have been typical in ancient Greece, where fidelity was really something important only for elite females. So Christopher Nolan is an experienced and very interesting director, so I'm super excited to see how he tackles this very ancient poem. And we're looking forward here at Carleton to the trailer. So if you'd like to see more, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and let us know, should we react to the trailer? Yes. Looking forward to seeing that with you at some later date.